On the 2nd of October 1992, one of the deadliest prison riots erupted at the Carandiru Penitentiary in Sao Paulo, Brazil. What started as a clash between rival gangs in the overcrowded prison escalated into a bloody and brutal crackdown by military police. At least 111 people were killed, and hundreds more left with life-threatening injuries, as the police enacted a shoot-first, ask-questions-later policy. In today's video, we will cover the Carandiru Massacre and the horrors that left the prison floors flooded with blood. It is perhaps helpful to start with a brief description of the Carandiru Penitentiary. The prison was built in 1920 and was supposed to house around 3,000 prisoners. The goal initially was a focus on rehabilitation through work programs, but as the prison grew ever more crowded, the prison was expanded. The construction of the new buildings did little to stop the overcrowding. At its peak, the prison held around 7,000 prisoners, more than double its official capacity, and making it the largest prison in Latin America. Such was the overcrowding that prisoners fell asleep on toilets owing to the lack of available space to sleep. Resources were fought over and guarded by the prison gangs. These gangs controlled much of the prisoners' lives and the prison economy, whether that be illegal substances, home-brewed alcohol, or the manufacturing of makeshift weapons. Many illicit activities were carried out. The limited resources, such as food and water, were heavily guarded by the inmates too, as even necessities were hard to come by. The very space of the prison too was unhealthy, with little in the way of sanitation allowing for the spread of diseases such as tuberculosis. So too did HIV and AIDS spread through the prostitution of some prisoners. As for the guards, overwhelmed by the sheer number of inmates, many were corrupt and heavy-handed in the dishing out of beatings. Tension only ever grew more and more in the prison due to these factors. Most prisoners were aged between 18 and 25 years old. Black or mixed race, poor, with little to no education. One of the most crowded places was known as Pavilion 9, housing around 2,000 prisoners. One prisoner would later say, "There are 2 sorting cells with up to 30 prisoners, sleeping on the floor, squeezed together, taking care not to touch their faces to their companions' feet." It was also one of the more violent parts of the prison, as many of the newer inmates or first-time offenders would end up in Pavilion 9. Grudges fresh from the outside world were more likely to be carried into the prison into Pavilion 9, leading to more stabbings and fights. On the 2nd of October 1992, a simple football match in Pavilion 9 sparked the riot that would lead to the massacre. In the morning, what started out as a friendly game of football escalated into physical aggression after the game. 2 inmates from opposing teams argued over the clothing line used in the match. Insults were traded, leading to punches flying and guards stepping in to stop the fighting. The 2 instigators were then dragged away. But friends of the 2 inmates who had started the altercation then in turn continued the fight. Only 15 guards were present at Pavilion 9, and they were trying to stop the escalation, but the commotion only grew and grew. The inmates were locked within Pavilion 9. The guards left them to commence the riot, as they were unable to stop the violence. Inmates armed with metal pipes and handmade knives fought, whilst others sought to escape the riot in their cells. Fires were lit, as the pavilion was in full control of the prisoners. At around 2 p.m, the director of the prison, named Dr. Pedrosa, notified the military police of the riot, and he requested their aid immediately. Led by Colonel Obiritan, the military police assembled outside the prison and prepared to storm the facility. Orders were given that maximum force could be used, and some police officers were reportedly told to shoot first and ask questions later. There was no civilian oversight or authority over the operation, with the military police in complete control. At around 3:30, the inmates responded to the sight of military police in different ways. The military police had a brutal reputation, so some prisoners displayed banners requesting a truce or peace, whilst others began throwing knives from the prison into the assembled officers. An attempt at negotiation was tried, but failed, Following this, some 350 military police officers stormed the pavilion. Dr. Ismail Pedrosa attempted to negotiate again, but he was forcibly moved aside by the police as he tried in vain to stop what would follow. The police, armed with pistols, shotguns, and machine guns, alongside their trained attack dogs, cut through the padlocked gate and entered. It should be noted that the military police removed their insignia and their identification badges in a grim attempt at anonymity before this massacre would unfold. The police took the pavilion floor by floor, cell by cell, but as they made their way through the prison, they did not differentiate between those engaging in the riot and those trying to hide in their cells. Autopsy reports of the 111 victims clearly show that the police fired with intention to kill. Most of the inmates who were killed were shot in the head and chest, such injuries accounting for almost 2/3 of all wounded. There are even plenty of examples of those killed when they had already surrendered, with wounds indicative of the person kneeling or laying down. Many of the inmates hiding in cells were dragged from their cells and executed in the halls. There are even accounts of officers entering a cell and demanding that people leave, only to be shot when they attempted to comply. Many of those wounded by the police were executed rather than sent to receive medical aid. Some accounts even detail how the police used bayonets to test whether a person was actually dead or merely playing dead, with those found to be faking it shot dead. According to one survivor, the police came in firing. They opened the door and told us to get out. We said to them, "We are unarmed." As one boy got up from the bed to go out, a policeman shot him 3 times from the doorway. The boy had only arrived at the prison the Friday before. He dragged himself across the floor as 3 more police officers entered. They fired a shot near the toilet area and killed another one. A policeman then called out, "There are some other ones alive here," and 3 more police officers came in with machine guns and gave a volley of machine gun shots at the 3 that were near the toilet. They went out, and we lifted the dead bodies onto ourselves and hid underneath. Prisoners were made to strip and run the gauntlet of officers with batons and dogs' jaws, then to sit in the courtyard. The dogs were used to devastating effect, with some survivors of the massacre having chunks of their thighs bitten off. Some of those killed were naked, indicating that they had already surrendered and complied with the request to strip before being killed. The state of the prison was horrendous. Between the flooding of water caused by broken pipes used as weapons and the dense smoke from the fires, the pavilion was destroyed. But such was the violence that the blood flooded the floors too. And with almost 20% of inmates affected with HIV or AIDS, there was serious risk of infection. There are some truly disturbing photographs that are not suitable for YouTube, of the dead in coffins, of blood-flooded floors, and the rooms filled with the dead. They are easily available online for those interested, but be aware that they are incredibly disturbing. After only 2 hours, the riot was brought to an end. Shortly after, prisoners were used to drag and move the bodies of their fellow prisoners to a large recreation room. The disturbance of the crime scenes only frustrated the investigators that followed. Though not everybody was located, some of those who were made to carry bodies in turn were executed by the police. Over the next few days, the bodies of the dead would be secretly removed from the prison aboard garbage trucks. After the massacre, the use of force was framed as self-defense, as the officers were entering a clearly dangerous situation. They also claimed that the risk of over 7,000 prisoners escaping was too great. This was used as justification for the deadly force employed. The injuries of the officers were exaggerated or even fabricated. 6 officers were injured by bullet ricochet, 1 by their own riot shield, and another of the injured had sustained an injury prior to the riot. Officers also fabricated evidence that the inmates had firearms and had shot at the police, with the police presenting a cart of guns only 2 hours after the riot had ended. Protests soon followed from the families of the victims of the massacre. From the start, incomplete and incorrect lists of the dead and injured only added to the confusion. Many of the injured struggled to find places at civilian hospitals, with delays to them receiving help for their injuries. Lawyers for the families resorted to visiting morgues to check whether the inmates were dead or missing. Families waiting outside the prison for news even had the dogs set upon them. Investigators entering the prison struggled to catalogue what had happened due to a lack of electricity and the dangerous conditions. It wasn't possible for them to take individual photographs of the dead, instead taking pictures of piles of bodies left in large rooms. Only half of the bullet marks in the prison were logged by forensics, and a comprehensive understanding of what happened was never achieved. Some 5,000 bullets were fired during the 2 hours, and over 500 ending up into the dead inmates. No attempts were made to match ballistics to the owner of the weapons used, again leading to a lack of accountability. It would not be until 2001 that criminal proceedings were initiated against 120 military police officers. But the court process was slow, and it was only in 2013 that the first batch of officers were sentenced. In April of 2013, 23 officers were found guilty of killing 13 prisoners on the first floor. They were sentenced to 156 years each. In August, another 25 officers were sentenced to over 600 years each for the deaths of 52 inmates on the second floor. However, although these sentences are heavily weighted, they are capped at 30 years, so they will only serve a maximum of 30 years. The officer who led the police operation, Colonel Obertian, was convicted in 2001 of using excessive force, but he was later acquitted on appeal. The colonel would later use the infamy gained from the massacre to successfully run for state deputy in 1994. But in 2006, he was found murdered in his apartment, a crime that is yet to be solved. The motive is unknown, but graffiti near his apartment read, "What goes around comes around," so we can take a guess. In 2002, the prison was closed, and all but one of the buildings was demolished. The grounds were turned into a public park, and a museum was also built. The museum highlights the issues of the prison system in Brazil, and the failures of allowing the military police to act with impunity. From the removal of insignia to the clear-up of the bodies, the military police acted in a way to prevent any consequences of their actions. Whatever one believes the purpose of a prison ought to be, the indiscriminate execution of rioting or hiding prisoners ought not to be a feature.